Today, I'm speaking with Riaz Meghji, the author of Every Conversation Counts. Riaz has been working on TV, podcaster, radio, presenting TEDx, speaking there. A fascinating career, switched from being a broker to speaking on human connections. Enjoy the conversation with Riaz. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. I'm Eric Rosenberg, and today I have the great pleasure of having as a guest Riaz Meghji. Riaz is a fascinating person. He wrote a book called Every Conversation Counts, the 5 Habits of Human Connection that build extraordinary relationships. He has been on TV, he's been on radio, he's been twice with TEDx in Canada presenting and speaking. I have a rock star as a guest today. So Riaz, thank you so much for taking the time.
Rock star, man. Thanks for the warm intro. I'll take that. It's great to be with you.
Well, the first time I saw you, it's actually you were like a rock star on stage at the MPI conference, the World Education Conference, last summer in San Francisco. And you spoke very eloquently about human connections, which to me is essential today. And obviously, this is what we're going to talk about. But before we get there, what is Riaz's journey? What is your story?
My story, I think, family that came from East Africa to Canada to create a life for myself and my brother. They hustled hard so we could explore what our passion truly could be. And I think my story is a familiar story to many people, where you're following a vision in life, which my vision for the longest time was a path to become an investment broker. And then soon realizing, is this my vision or is this my parents' vision? And 20 years ago, I took a leap of faith and deviated from the safer financial path and went after this passion in the presentation space. And for 20 years, I've had the chance to interview thousands of people for a living as a television host and broadcaster, and just learn from every single conversation. And the one thing that stood out was the power of human connection, whether it be leaders, athletes, philanthropists, celebrities. This unifying sense of belonging and connection always intrigued me. And I find myself now in a space living a life on purpose, like true purpose of exploring how we build these relationships personally and professionally that'll make this a rewarding and fulfilling life.
That's amazing. Now, if you can take us back to the moment where you decide, no, I don't want to be a broker. That's not what I want to be doing. Then I'll have to speak with my parents. But what was the tipping point there?
The tipping point, I credit someone that's a friend today and that has become a mentor ever since this conversation happened. 20 years ago, Quebec City, at a conference for an international student organization, ISEC. I was in the 5th year of studying my finance degree at Simon Fraser University. So the path was set. I was in my final semester. And this individual, his name is Lotfi, and I write about him in the book because he's such a force for positivity. He was the co-chair of this ISEC conference, and he sat in on some of my sessions where I presented and facilitated. And after that conference, he pulled me aside and he said, hey, look, I know you've got this plan that you're going to go down the financial path, you're going to be a broker. And he said, look, I don't think you should do any of that. And he said, look, you are 22 years old. The world is your oyster. What I just saw on stage, I believe you have something to offer in the presentation space. And I remember looking at him and absorbing the words he gave me. And I thought that is pretty cool when somebody gives you a vote of confidence like that. And I looked him straight in the eye and I said, yes, I'm 22 years old. But I also come from a South Asian family. So if I don't come home a doctor, lawyer, dentist, or some sort of financial expert, I'm like, we're going to have a problem here. And he did not hesitate when he fired back, Eric, and he said, when are you going to stop playing safe and start living your life? And I'll never forget this moment because he had such a conviction in his belief in my potential. I was fortunate enough, and I think this is the beauty of mentorship, where you have somebody that sees your potential before you see it for yourself.
Absolutely.
And then my eyes were wide open of, what life am I living here? Is this the vision from my parents? Or truly, is this something I could do? Because I loved the idea of presenting on stage. And I entered every single contest possible in the broadcast space because everyone said you got to go to a small market. This is how it works. And I just thought, what if I just try this? Look at the medium and inject a contribution that I thought was needed in television. And after a few months, I landed my first internship at MTV in Canada. And that's sparked the first on-air gig I had. And for 20 years, I continue to learn, grow in the medium, watch speakers, watch hosts, and just absolutely love what I do. And I credit Lotfi for that defining moment to say, do it for you, don't do it for someone else.
That's awesome. Now you're talking about two things that I experienced some years before. Actually, MTV, I remember the launch of MTV, but I think was the video from the Bangles, Video Kills the Radio Star. I don't know the group there, but you mentioned ISEC, which changed my life as well. And in 1989, dating myself now, I was at the international conference of ISEC in Quebec City.
Oh, no way.
And I remember the first time I spoke in public, I was so scared. It was for ISEC, and it was actually in Denmark, that my lips was tight. There was no more saliva, and my lips were glue there. And I keep an hour putting the lips down. And afterwards, I asked for feedback, and people say, well, the content was great, but what were you doing with your lips all the time? I say, man, I was so scared.
That dry mouth is killer.
How did you get from listening to somebody who sees potential in you to actually practicing, becoming totally comfortable in front of a camera, in front of a mic, or on stage? How did you do that?
I think the key word right there you share is listening. So it's one in my personal story of listening to someone like Lotfi, or if you're listening to this, listening to a mentor that said something, and then two, listening to your own intuition. Where, somebody, I could be saying to you, hey, Eric, congrats on your book just coming out. Hey, did you do this with your book? Did you do that with your book? And it's easy for someone to say, hey, okay, I'm totally stressed out. Well, what is making you stressed out? Are you listening to your intuition of, oh, I should be doing those things? Or I could be saying all that to you and you're like, no, it's not my goal. I'm not trying to build a consulting business. And you're still listening to your intuition. It's truly looking at, when that was introduced to me, it lit a fire. And then two, staying open. I mean, one of the biggest things that to this day, that there's two pieces of advice. When people say, hey, what's the great advice you'd give yourself 20 years back? It's one, find a coach, and two, stay coachable. And when I entered the business, I remember going to a conference, a television conference, and asking a host who had been on camera for 15 years, I said, how long did it take you to get comfortable doing this? And he looked at me and he said, I'm still figuring this out. And it blew my mind because he was the veteran, but he talked about the notion of complacency. And I think complacency was disrupted over the past couple of years. If we look at this uncertainty we've all been through, Absolutely. Where I realized that complacency cultivates mediocrity. And he says, the moment you become complacent in this business, you will be replaced. So in that, I wanted to enter the craft of presenting like a sponge and maintain a beginner's mindset of how do we do this? How can I bring my authentic self? And in the beginning, it was awkward because I got caught up in the trap of reading chat logs of people critiquing me, and I wasn't used to that. So the business helps you build a really thick skin. And after a while, you release that because you slowly understand you will never have 100% approval rate no matter what you do. When you are in the public eye, if you take a stance and you are passionate about something, there'll be those that connect. There'll be those that challenge it or it's not for them. And that is okay. So I think it's staying open, the beginner's mindset, and finding people that I respected that did the craft well and asking them for feedback of how to improve it every time out. And I did that in my television career. I still do that in my speaking career because any contribution you make, it's to the best of your ability in that moment. But having the courage to ask for help and having that humility, I think is the way to continue to push yourself forward, whether you're a speaker or you're pursuing any meaningful passion in your life.
Absolutely. Who were your mentors? Or is it the same now, 20 years later, or it changed?
It's totally changed. Like from television, it would be asking producers that had seen a lot of TV hosts. We'd watch playback on the shows I'd host, kind of like sports, athletes do it all the time. They watch game footage. And then when I got into speaking, I was really intentional. I credit, there's a great communication coach in America, Nick Morgan.
Yes.
His company, Public Words.
Working
Nick
the room.
Yeah, like he is such a brilliant, brilliant mind. And he's been not only a friend, but a terrific mentor that, and then when I met him, he said, "Hey, how do you like your feedback? Do you like it sugar coated or do you like some tough love?" And I said, "Give it to me straight. I'm coming out of the TV business where you're used to the trolls on Twitter, where people are coming at you and you learn how to hug your haters sometimes. But I loved his honesty and transparency. And it made me think about something very important. If anybody is looking for a mentor, find somebody that one cares about you. And if they deepen that connection with you, you know, when they lean in, they're calling you up. They are not calling you out. And that is the beauty of someone like a Nick Morgan.
I love that. Calling you up, not calling you out. That's awesome. You speak a lot about human connections, and more than ever, human connection are essential. How do we connect with other humans when most people now, many people now working from home, connecting through Zoom? That must be challenging for a lot of people.
I think it starts with intention. And if we look at any model for change in behavior, where is the starting point? There's an intention, there's an action, it becomes a behavior. Then, if that is consistent, then a habit, and then that is who you are. And what's happened in these past 2 years, the shift in the choreography of how we connect, I think we took for granted all of these simple nuances of how we could, if you or I, if the two of us were in the same room, like when we met in San Francisco on the field in Giant Stadium, I mean, what a place to meet. But we have this luxury of listening with our eyes and reading each other's cues. You know, I'll credit Nick Morgan for one of the greatest things he said to me about connection, that gesture precedes conscious thought. And as we kind of worked together during the pandemic, I thought this was one of the biggest causes of virtual fatigue because we couldn't read the cues we were traditionally used to seeing and subconsciously reading. So I think one, it takes intention of how we're checking in with one another, how we're building spaces in our meetings. For example, if you're leading a meeting with your team, Eric, and you start that meeting on a Monday morning and you're like, all right, here's our agenda, here's what we're going to cover. Bang, bang, bang. You get it all done. Are you productive? Yep. Was it economical that everyone could just click the camera on? Yep. Was it efficient? Absolutely. But in many ways, efficiency can be the enemy of human connection because we're moving too fast. And I think intentionally finding pockets to slow down where you have moments to check in at the beginning of these meetings, that's one. Two, recognizing our roles have changed. If you're a leader, you're not just managing people and their responsibilities. Now you're managing energy. And in a hybrid reality, some people are doing 2 days in the office. Some people are 100% remote. Everyone has a different set of expectations. So I think we really need to get intentional with checking in, letting people know how they're doing, asking for feedback so people understand where they stand instead of a guessing game of if you reached out all of a sudden said, "Hey, Riaz, can we talk?" Those three words can be terrifying if you don't know where you stand. But if we're in constant rapport and constant relationship, and you say, "Can we talk?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what do we need?" And it's an exciting activity as opposed to, is this going to be a bad thing? And there's a guessing game.
In all the research you've done, the people you've interviewed, the study, I know you've also did the executive program in Harvard. Have you seen differences in cooperation or environment organization where the human connections are actually working very well and there's an emphasis on it versus organization where, to your point, it's very efficient, but it just focus on the agenda?
Yeah, there is one company that actually stands out recently. I love this question. I was doing a keynote in July of 2022, so just a couple months back. And this company, Brooks Running, people culture, I had heard about this culture being strong, but what they did was they created a leadership summit for the first time. I think this was in 3 or 4 years, where leaders from around the world could be in the same room. And the interesting part of your question is when you have cultural differences, the notion of trying to understand how people show up is so important. And they led with this. They led with prioritizing human connection and asking questions before start telling people, here's the direction, here's the vision we want to move. Because as hybrid becomes, a part of our regular life, you could look at someone from a different country or different culture, and they could be looking at me saying, well, Riaz is so over the top. He's so expressive with his hands and he's bringing so much emotion. That's too much for me. But then you have somebody else from a reserved culture where they don't have that same emotion. And I could mistakenly read that as, oh, they're not interested. They're disengaged. They're not giving me anything back. So I think now is that opportunity. And I love seeing it in companies like this where they employ the philosophy where look at you is greater than look at me. And they lead with this sense of empathetic curiosity to understand, where are you? What do you need right now? How can we make this work and align with the values of the organization? Because at the end of the day, whether it's one company in North America or you have multiple countries, involved, and not just Canada and the US, people support what they create. And if we're constantly asking these questions, we empower them to be a part of the process and the solution, and that's meaningful progress for them.
And that's what you and I learn in different time, but with ISEC, it's working with different cultures and how people react. Absolutely. What is the best way to give feedback to maintain human connections? Because I know how many times have I heard people say, I want you to be honest with me, until you start being honest. And then we're like, whoa. What is your advice there?
Yeah. Well, there's two thoughts that come out. I mean, you could be honest and someone's not ready for that honesty and they take it the wrong way. And if they don't know you, if you're essentially a stranger to them, that could create a great sense of distance. So, two thoughts that stand out. One, in psychology, there's this term known as the pratfall effect, where it's important to convey credibility before vulnerability. And if you've got that credibility in place where you're that point of respect or that person in authority, and you've earned it, and you lean in and you get honest and you get vulnerable about what's going on, that has the real opportunity to bring people closer. But if people are questioning your competence to begin with, and then you come out with this honesty, it could backfire and create distance instead of connection, because it could be considered, hey, oversharing, or it's not too much, or we haven't built trust. And I think that gets into the second point of how do you build trust with someone, especially if it's a new relationship. And I champion the idea of discovery before you dismiss, and leading with this empathetic curiosity with questions that unlock and allow the other person to share. That even though I have some feedback I'm going to share, allow them to speak to it first. For example, if there is something that I feel hasn't gone the way that we had hoped, I would open it up and say, hey, Eric, tell me, how do you feel this is going? How do you feel that went? And allow the person to start reflecting. And then the more they share, if there's a roadblock, lead with these questions that start with how and what. And it's, well, what do you feel, Eric? What is impossible for you right now? What's the real roadblock? What would make it possible? And then again, it's them being a part of the solution, of them understanding, okay, here's where I'm really struggling. Here's what we could do. And then maybe even leaning in with the empathetic point of, hey, okay, what's the question I failed to ask to understand your reality? And how can I show up for you in bigger ways? And when we've done that, that person begins to understand you are prioritizing the relationship through a sense of discovery before dismissing where they're at altogether. And then if we do that, we kind of disarm the tension or the perceived tension, because sometimes we get in our own heads about this stuff. And that person, when they realize you're prioritizing the relationship, then we can start to introduce these pieces of logic and focus on what we can agree on, even if we're in different ends of the spectrum, and leaning in with the questions of, okay, so what's the real challenge? What would it take for this to work? So people begin to understand, hey, it's the two of us versus this challenge instead of me versus you. And I think that empathetic curiosity allows us to get to more productive disagreements, but more productive outcomes in the end.
I like that. And also walking the talk, probably, because if you, my boss, and come to me and really show empathy and asking what questions, and then don't follow up on it and come back again with those same questions, it doesn't feel authentic.
Absolutely. That is a great point. I mean, if we think about the idea, this podcast, we're talking about the business of meetings. Anyone can go to a meeting and then have this euphoric feeling from seeing something on stage or content they connect with. And they're like, I'm going to go change my life now. Great. The next day, boom, they're caught up in their long day of meetings. and a jam-packed agenda and nothing changes. The follow-up is so key. It's so key. It's that consistency that's going to cultivate trust where you have that defining moment, but then doing something with that moment to check in with them to show, hey, I care about you. I'm checking in. I'm calling you up in this, and you're a part of this. You told me this is what you need. I'm here to support you. And that takes intentional effort to be consistent over the long run.
Absolutely. I also recommend for people listening to have an accountability buddy on the priorities that you have, whatever your role, and it might be somebody who's totally outside of your organization. I have an accountability buddy every Monday, 5 p.m. Eastern. He's on the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. We just connect for 30 minutes, and that's also helping keeping your priorities straight. And that's also something that I know is very important for you when you talk about human connection and leadership. It's actually servant leadership. It's helping your team. Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of the world we live in, the working from home or not in the office, and difficulty to connect directly face to face? What is the role of a leader in facilitating those human connections and really serving his or her own team?
Yeah, I think listening to this question, the first word that pops out to me is the power of consistency, and kind of building on where we've been going in this conversation of the consistency of feedback. Is this leader, especially virtually, providing a steady stream of consistent feedback? And this could be intentional praise, this could be constructive criticism, where the person on the other side knows the leader's invested in my growth and progress. Because at the end of the day, what's more motivating than a sense of meaningful progress? Is the leader consistently not only asking for feedback, but asking for input? Like, for example, brainstorming sessions. This is really important, where you're creating arenas where the employees get the chance to share their input. And I know virtually it's tricky, because if you've been onboarded virtually, you haven't met anybody, sometimes you might be a little shy to speak up because you don't want to alienate yourself from the group. A simple way to do this is say, all right, we're going to have this session and we're going to brainstorm for questions, not answers. So people don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing, but they're leading with the sense of curiosity that can unlock different solutions. And then they're a part of the collective contribution. And the other part is, are you delivering a sense of consistent accessibility? Where if somebody is struggling virtually as a leader, if they need to reach you, are you going to make yourself available? And this could be for 5 minutes. This could be for 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be for a whole hour. They just know if they need help, you're there to serve them with this idea of delivering value as a leader. So consistency with feedback, consistency with their contribution, and consistency with accessibility, I think, are very important points right now in this hybrid reality to help lift people up and keep them motivated and, above all, engaged.
Great point. Thanks for that, Riaz. You mentioned the business of meetings. Obviously, each of us, whether we want it or like it or not, one day or another, we need to make presentation, whether it's with client, with the team. So I know you mentioned your mentor, you mentioned Nick Morgan, the great books to read for sure. Can you maybe take us through your own preparation when you had to speak at WEC? That can also give some ideas and hints to people when it comes to presenting to customer or presenting a workshop or a keynote.
I'm a firm believer the number one thing that gets overlooked when anybody's approaching the idea of a presentation is the audience. It is so easy to get in our head of how do we deliver the perfect, the most impactful presentation. And watching speakers, I believe the best speakers are the best listeners. So whether it was WEC or any keynote I'm going to do, the work that is done beforehand to understand the audience. For example, one of the most common points of feedback I hear from leaders that I coach is, I'm nervous. And then I say, what drives this sense of anxiety? I don't know if this is going to land. I don't know if they've heard this already. I don't know if this is thought-provoking enough. And the first thing I ask them is, well, have you talked to anybody before that'll be in this audience that could answer these questions? And they say, no. That is step one. And what I love to do is not only talk to event organizers that have a great insight into the theme and vision they're trying to bring to life, but asking if I can talk to 2 or 3 leaders that will be in the audience to understand more personalized context of where they are, where they've been, and where they really want to go, and what needs to be challenged, what needs to be celebrated, what do they need right now compared to what they don't already have. And that information, that context, then allows me to understand what is the value I can bring to this equation to serve them in such a profound way where it almost combats the nerves and converts them from nerves to excitement of, I cannot wait to deliver this because I know they need it. And then you get into this servant mindset of, I am so excited to bring this value to this group. So the number one starting point is, how can you care about your audience more? And ask these questions well before you even take that stage.
Okay, so that's first. Now you answer those questions. You spoke with several people in MPI, and you say, okay, those are maybe the needs they have, the value I can bring. Then what?
Yeah, when we're looking at the meeting aspect, and for example, when we look at MPI, the second question was, how do I create an experience? Because right now, coming out of this pandemic, a lot of people want to connect. They want to talk about what is going on. So what I also like to do is interview a leader that can participate live on stage in the session to role model how we make the experience interactive. So MPI offered up a great leader who is the CRO of MPI now, and she shared a very personal story. But I also,
she was wonderful.
Yeah, and that is amazing. But I also invited the audience to do the exact same thing where they have a moment to share something that's personal, a story about a defining conversation. So we make it about them, make it about the leader, and have them thinking, oh, I could do this with my teams. I could do this with my loved ones. So creating that sense of experience and then how that shows up in the presentation. And then ultimately, whether you have 10 minutes or an hour, I think it's understanding if you have all of that context, you know how you can engage the audience, then crafting the power of story. What are relevant stories for this audience? How can you present their pain? So they're sitting there nodding, saying, Eric totally understands me. He's done the work. He knows what this day-to-day is. So they're leaning in, thinking, well, how do I get through this? And then introducing what you believe to be your valuable framework of ideas, of tips, because people want actionable ideas that they can walk out of your session thinking, this is how I'm going to act differently now and bring more to my team. So context, interaction, engagement, deciding the storytelling content, which I believe is imperative. If you don't have storytelling, then you just have information without emotion, and that just becomes forgettable. But then presenting the pain and then presenting the solution for that pain.
That's awesome. My last question on that, I know it's very tactical, this one, but I'm very curious. How many times do you rehearse before delivering?
Oh, that is interesting. I think the way I would answer this is I can't even answer that question because I've rehearsed so many times. And I believe for me, deciding what the framework of the presentation is going to be is one part. And then I would say that's like 70%, where you have your foundational content, and then 30% is customized for the context for this group, and then the Q&A of what the audience will give you. But for me, the rehearsal is such an important part of it, and practicing out loud. Like, you see actors do this with film and TV. They do a table read before they'll ever record it on camera. Even scripting out some of your key foundational elements, not presenting or memorizing it verbatim, but what your key ideas will be, and then anticipating what are some of the big questions. And the beauty of presenting, what I'm finding is there are always two teachers in the room. You or I could take a stage and present and share ideas, but I'm always waiting for the moment somebody introduces a question that can evolve the message, and I'll document it, or they'll share a comment or perspective of something that they learned. And I think that is so fascinating. And I think that is the moment of the presenter to be intentional with the pauses and just let the moment breathe. Listen to that audience. When you throw that question out, if they don't respond right away, hey, we haven't responded to people in person in 2 years. It's going to take a minute to stand up in front of 200 or 2,000 people, but just being present in that moment. But Yeah, I think there's countless rehearsal and reiteration going on how to make the message better every time out that I couldn't even tell you how many times I rehearse. I think I'm just committed to the craft and listening to the audience every single time of how to make this better and a more impactful experience next time out.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Riaz. I know you're very busy and we could talk for hours, but our time is limited. So I want to be respectful of your time. I have one last question for today.
Yeah.
We have so many ways of communicating, really, whether it's, all the social media platform and going from afterwards, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegrams, Voxer, Facebook, TikTok, Messenger, LinkedIn. I don't even know where I send a message before. And in the meantime, sometimes I feel that we have so many means of connecting, but in terms of human connection, we're not as connected as we were in the past. And when I look at different generation, the way communication is done is totally different. So what is your advice for people listening in terms of managing team with different generations, and also in terms of which tool really to use to strengthen the human connections?
It's a really unique question you're asking, because I think to answer it involves understanding the context that your people, whether that's personal or professional, respond to the most. And if you do that of simply asking them and almost creating a charter of trust, say this is an international team. Hey, Eric, how do you like to communicate? Is it text? Is it email? Is it video? When do you like to communicate? What does flexibility look like to you? What type of frequency do you like with your communication that serves you so you feel heard and acknowledged? And once we've done all that, especially in a team, then asking and getting people to provide their suggestions, coming back to the idea of people support what they create, that they were a part of the process. Like one of the most common things I'm hearing from companies is, how do I get people to come back to the office? Well, if you mandate it, will you truly motivate people? Probably not, because we understood the flexibility is something that could work with the hybrid reality. So I think it's understanding what people need most when they communicate, and then leaning into that. And your thing, one of the interesting things I discovered this summer, and this was almost serendipity, because my smartphone just started glitching out. So I couldn't text people. My screen was broken. And for a month, and I was waiting to get a new phone in September because I was just stubborn. And people were telling me the best deals are in September. I'm like, okay, I'll hang on to this. But what I ended up doing was, instead of texting people, I'd send them voice notes or video messages. Yeah. And they were like, is this because you just work in human connection? And I kind of laughed, and I'm like, look, my phone's not working. But they said, I totally appreciate the personal touch instead of just texting me. I'm going to start sending people voice notes. And even starting your day of thinking, what are 5 voice notes I could send out? These could be messages of 10 to 15 seconds to people in your life. Maybe someone you haven't talked to in a long time and you're just thinking of them. Mm-hmm. Sending that message that, hey, you know what? I woke up today, I'm smiling because, hey, Eric, I remember that moment that we shared that we both were connected to ISEC on the field in Giant Stadium in San Francisco. I just thought of you, man. And thanks for doing what you're doing. Can't wait to be on your podcast. Those simple, touch points, I think, are such a great opportunity for people to say, this person cares about me. I'm on their mind. It takes intention. It involves all of us breaking out of autopilot mode. And if we do it and we outcare the person next to us, we'll cultivate a culture of loyalty, whether that's personally or professionally.
Riaz, wonderful end to this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope to see you very soon, face to face.
Let's do it again, man. Eric, thank you so much for this space. Congrats on your podcast and congrats on your new book. I see it in the back, man. Big things. Thank you.
Thank you. Riaz, thank you so much for sharing your insight today. And I love what you say about giving feedback, that you want to actually up the person and not out the person. I think it's a wonderful concept. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to connect with me, please go on LinkedIn or go to the www.eventbusinessformula.com/group to join my Facebook group. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your network. Thank you. Bye-bye.